Erev Tov, Bruchim Habaim. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us this evening for what will be, I think, an amazing hour. For those of you who don't know, my name is Mandy Winston. I am the Chief Executive of UJIA. And at UJIA, we wake up every morning and go to bed every night thinking about how can we connect the UK Jewish community with what is happening in Israel. And as we thought over the last year about what are the most meaningful moments where we can create virtual events, the idea of doing something around the Israeli election was really of vital importance. And tonight, we are really grateful that we're going to have an opportunity to unravel some of the election results, to think about what comes next, and to hear from some really expert people in the field who can really help us understand and make sense of what's been going on. Like many of you, I am a British Jew with a strong connection to Israel. I'm an Israeli, and I can say that for me, one of those very few moments of Zionism that happened for Israelis during the year is actually going to the voting booth. And obviously doing that 4 times in the recent period of time has been a burden. And we are hoping very much that tonight and tomorrow and the next few days that we will see some kind of sense coming out of the events of the last few months. With that, I'm going to hand over to our friend, Eylon Levy from I24 News, who is a news anchor and analyst. And he's going to lead us tonight through a process of really educating ourselves and trying to understand what on earth is going on. So, Eylon, lovely to see you here with us this evening. Thank you so much for agreeing to be with us.
Thank you, Mandy. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I think the question that the UJIA posed for the subject of this talk was eerily prophetic. What happened? If anything, I would add a couple of interrobangs, because everyone woke up this morning asking what just happened last night in Israel's elections, the 4th in 2 years. No one's sure that it's the last for the foreseeable future. And I'm very glad to be joined by 3 very special people who are going to be having an open discussion here as we try to process each from our different perspectives what happened yesterday. First of all, Lahav Harkov, my friend, the senior contributing editor for the Jerusalem Post and diplomatic correspondent. Hello, Lahav. I hope you managed to get some sleep.
Not much. I'm here with my. See, this is a group in the UJIA that I have my cup of tea with me, keeping me awake. But
between the kids and the election. Also joined by Raoul Wootliff, the presenter of the Times of Israel Daily Briefing podcast and former political correspondent. Hello, Raoul.
Hi, Eylon. Good to be here.
And we're also joined by outgoing member of Knesset Michal Cotler-Wunsh, who entered the last Knesset with the Telem party, sat with the blue and white faction, didn't contest this election. We hope very much he'll be back soon and have no doubt that there will be another election sooner rather than later. Hello, Michal.
Thank you for being here, everybody.
In just a few minutes, we'll open up a conversation with our guests here. But first, I want to take a look at the results and talk through how we got here, what happened, and then we can try to unpack what happened. So if we can bring up this fantastic presentation, this slide from BICOM. We can see that essentially when the exit polls came in, and really when we saw the live results this morning, Israel elected 12 tribes and a king. One large party, the Likud party, Benjamin Netanyahu's ruling right-wing party. One medium party, Yesh Atid, on 17 seats. And then no fewer than 10 parties in the single digits. I'm not sure Israel's ever had quite such a degree of fragmentation with really tiny parties. And they really range an incredible array of the diversity of Israeli society. On the one hand, we have Shas and United Torah Judaism, the ultra-Orthodox parties that are considered Benjamin Netanyahu's natural partners. They're expected to go with him. Together, they also have the religious Zionists, a coalition both of Bezalel Smotrich's far-right religious nationalist group, and also other elements, the Kahanist Jewish Power Party, the homophobic Noam party as well. Prime Minister Netanyahu made sure to shidduch a marriage of convenience over there to make sure that there was minimum vote spillage on the right. That is the bloc that is expected to go with Netanyahu, even though there are elements there who could cause him serious headache in a coalition, particularly within the religious Zionist party. But they're on only 52 seats. And on the other side, let's remember when Israeli news shows present the results, they're not showing right-wing bloc, left-wing bloc. It's the pro-Netanyahu bloc, the changed Netanyahu bloc, and then the couple of parties in the middle who are really throwing a blinder. So the main party is Yesh Atid, secular, a liberal party, did very well in Tel Aviv, for example, picking up around a fifth to a quarter of the vote, by far the most popular party within sort of the greater Tel Aviv area. Its natural partners are the blue and white party, Benny Gantz. Remember, they ran in the last election together, split off. No real ideological differences, but they largely splintered on the question of whether it was right for Benny Gantz to join Benjamin Netanyahu's government. They got 8 seats. The Labour Party rising from the dead on 7 seats. Meretz, were they successful, what we call a Gewalt campaign in Israel, warning people that it was at risk of extinction, getting 5 seats. And Yisrael Beitenu, the largely Russian secular nationalist party, on 7 seats. Let's remember this whole election balagan started off when Yisrael Beitenu defected from Netanyahu's bloc. They're still very much a right-wing party, defected from Netanyahu's bloc and decided it was time to replace him. Also on the bloc to oppose Netanyahu, the joint list, the coalition of 3 Arab parties, Hadash, the communists, Balad, the Arab nationalists, and Tal. And then here are 2 parties where everything becomes very interesting in this election. On the one hand, Yamina, headed by Naftali Bennett, national religious figure, but ran this campaign very much on a question of who can govern the country, who can get the economy back up and running after the election, running to replace Netanyahu, but not ruling out, propping Netanyahu up, and had expected to be the kingmaker in this election. But when the results began to come in, we saw that Ram, the Islamist party, Ram is the United Arab List, not to be confused with the Joint List, got 5 seats, and that means that neither of the blocs has a majority. Netanyahu doesn't have a majority. The opposition doesn't seem to have a majority, at least not least to form a coherent coalition. And the question is, what is Ram going to do? A real sea change in Israeli politics, an Arab party saying, we're in nobody's pocket. We're going to sit back. We're going to hear from both sides, see what they have to offer, and then we're going to trade our support. And in our discussion, we're going to discuss what exactly happened with Ram. So a few words on how the night evolved, and I'll take a couple of minutes to step back and ask how we got here more broadly. When the exit polls came in at 10 o'clock Israel time, the Netanyahu's bloc plus Yamina seemed to have 61 seats. And if those results had held, it seemed to be a done deal. Netanyahu would have a solid right-wing government, just as he promised. But then things got interesting. By about 1 in the morning, the exit polls were updated to show that the anti-Netanyahu bloc received 61 seats. Now, even if they weren't able to form a government, that might be enough to pass legislation barring Netanyahu as a criminal defendant from running again, or at least assuming the premiership, and really putting a spoke in his wheels ahead of perhaps another election. Then it got even more interesting, because by the morning, the numbers had swung to show that Netanyahu plus Yamina plus Naftali Bennett had got 63 seats. That would have given them a narrow but perhaps stable majority. And then the shock came about 8 o'clock, 8:30, 9 o'clock this morning, just as I was making my coffee and trying to understand what was going on, that Ram, the Islamist party that represents mainly Bedouin Arabs in the south, passed the electoral threshold as they said they would all night. No one believed them, essentially making them kingmakers, although it's not clear that they really have that power, because on the one hand, they can't prop up, they might not be able to prop up the right-wing bloc, with Yamina saying it doesn't want to sit in a government propped up by Ram. On the other hand, it's not clear that if they back the opposition, we're going to get anywhere or find a government that's formed. And it means at the moment there are really 4 possible scenarios for where we could go, and we'll unpack this together in our discussion. One possibility is that Netanyahu manages to form a coalition in the end, perhaps pulling away some defectors, perhaps also with Ram. Pardon me, I forgot to mention one party. There are so many of them. The New Hope Party, headed by Gidon Saar, who was a defector from the Likud party, running what he hoped would be a right-wing national campaign. The big disappointment of the night, had started the polls as the second largest party, ended up on 6th. We'll discuss that in a little bit. So one option is Netanyahu manages to pull a rabbit out of his hat and gets a majority. Another option, perhaps Yair Lapid from Yesh Atid manages to form a coalition. It's difficult to see how that might happen, but it's possible he'll get the first crack at the whip forming a government. Another option is that someone else might be able to form a government by playing the coalition maths to their advantage. And another option that I think people are being a lot more open about this time compared to previous elections, where it was spoken about sarcastically as a possible possibility, is fifth elections. And that's where things could get very interesting, because if we have fifth elections and no government is formed by November, then Benny Gantz becomes prime minister by default. So how did we get here? Essentially, this crisis started in April 2019, elections that seemed to produce a fifth term for Netanyahu. That's how all the media reported it, until Avigdor Lieberman decided that, no, he didn't want to join Netanyahu's government. At that point, Netanyahu's bloc only had 60 seats. The Knesset dissolved itself. We went to elections, and in the second and third elections, no one was able to form a government. Time and again, we had the same dynamic. Netanyahu, the biggest party, the biggest bloc, unable to form a government. The opposition, unable to agree amongst themselves. In the third election, a grand national unity government was formed between Netanyahu's bloc and the Blue and White Party, which was a bit bigger than what we see on the map here. Largely because of the coronavirus crisis, Benny Gantz felt that he was compelled to join the government in order to save Israel from the crisis of coronavirus. And since then, messages back and forth about whether that was the right choice and he regrets it, or it was the wrong choice, never mind. And the government essentially collapsed because of the failure to pass a budget. One of the reasons for the failure to pass a budget, if you ask the cynics amongst us, although this is really the prevailing opinion, under the coalition agreement, Benny Gantz was meant to become prime minister next November as part of a rotation agreement. And pretty much the only way for Netanyahu to get out of that was to have fresh elections. And one of the only ways to trigger fresh elections and remain prime minister was for the Knesset to fail to pass a budget. They failed to pass a budget. We went to fresh elections. New parties sprouted up like mushrooms, mixed and matched. What we have now scenario, 12 parties, only one large party, one medium-sized party, lots of small parties, and lots of potential for defections and mixes and merges and matchups. So with that, I hope the numbers are sort of vaguely clear, and I'll turn to my friends to try to make sense of what just happened. But before I actually start looking at what the scenarios are for where we could go next, maybe we should just take a step back and talk about really the big question of this election. Who are Iran? Who are the Islamist Party? Where did they come from? What do they want? And what does this signal as a change in Israeli politics? Who wants to pick up from them? Lahav?
Okay, I wasn't sure if it was like a rhetorical question or if you wanted us to talk.
No. Let's go for it. Let's just keep the conversation going. Yeah.
So yeah, the joint list. It was an Arab bloc that was formed before the 2015 election. They were four separate Arab parties, or predominantly Arab parties, and usually they would run sort of in blocks of two parties at a time. But the electoral threshold was raised to 3.25% in 2014, and they were worried that having two smaller blocks, they wouldn't pass the threshold, and they started running together as the joint list. Now, these parties, the thing that they have in common is that they are all Arab parties, but they, Arab is a very broad category, and you had within this block the Islamists, of Ra'am, and you had the communists of Hadash, you had the extreme Arab nationalists of Balad, and you had Tal, which is the Ahmed TV is the celebrity party. And so, they all ran together, but they didn't necessarily agree on a lot of the domestic things, even though in broad strokes they agreed on the Palestinian things, even though like within the Palestinian context, they support different parties there. They never got along very well, but they made it work because they did much better. The sum is greater than the whole of its parts, right? They did much better as one joint list than they did as separate parties. But that all kind of came to a head in the last year. After the second and third elections, when the joint list suddenly became a greater part of the process, they recommended Gantz for prime minister. There was talk of a coalition that would rely on the joint list votes in order to be established. There was a sort of a sense of like inspiration almost in the Arab public that, oh, we can really be a part of a conversation. We can really take part in politics. Now, Mansour Abbas, the head of Ra'am, the Islamist party, he took that farther than the rest in saying, we can also work with Netanyahu. If Gantz is the prime minister, we can start talking to Netanyahu and try to work with him to get, the maximum for our constituents. In addition, there were the ongoing tensions especially with Hadash, the Communist Party, over sort of more domestic and social issues. And that came to the fore when there was a vote on outlawing conversion therapy for LGBT people, which Hadash wanted to outlaw it, and Ra'am did not want to outlaw it. And on the whole, I mean, this is a little bit of a different issue, but it's related. The issue of gay rights among Israeli Arabs is very, very controversial, and there have been some big news stories about it in this election, but also over the past couple of years in civil society as well. And so, the tensions within the joint list sort of increased over that issue as well. And in the end, Ra'am decided to break off from the rest of the joint list. They said, we're going to go on our own path of working more with whoever's in power, really, in order to get more things for our constituents, to be better advocates for our constituents. And the joint list said, we're going to continue doing what we've done all along. And they split up. And it turns out that Mansour Abbas's idea of sort of being a greater part of the political conversation had a lot of support. That even though the Israeli Arab public doesn't love Netanyahu's attempts to be Abu Yair, the popular politician in that Arab street, did not go so amazingly for him, as far as I can tell. But they did like the idea of a party that was willing to work with Netanyahu. And so, not only did they pass the threshold, but I think they did better than anyone expected.
Eylon, I would love to
Michal,
know.
you were serving in the Michal, you were serving in the Knesset, rubbing shoulders with the lawmakers of the UAL, Ra'am, the Islamist Party. What sort of vibe, what impression did you get from them? What do they want? Where do they fit into Israeli politics? Because in many ways, they split off saying we're not left wing. They're religious fundamentalists. In many respects, they actually have a lot more in common with Shas and the religious Zionist Party than they do with Meretz and the rest of the center left.
So I actually wanted to offer a very interesting perspective. I am the outgoing chair of the Alcohol and Drug Use Committee in this Knesset. And actually, the members, very active members of my committee, are as follows. They are Mansour Abbas, they are Yossi Tayyib from Shas, and they're Eliyahu Baruchi from Yadut Torah. And every Sunday, we toured addiction centers and communities that offer sort of the support for former addicts. Together, the four of us. I mean, I always said to people it was like the beginning of a good joke. Woman, an Arab, and a Shasnik, and a ultra Orthodox man walking to an addiction center every Sunday. And I want to share that the experience from that committee, and of course, it really touches upon the many issues that you and Lahav have touched upon. In the sense that Mansour Abbas actually very, very early on in this last Knesset's life, all 9 months of it, made it very clear that he was going to focus on civilian issues, on challenges of the Arab sector. But before that already, because and I don't know if our listeners are aware, but because there is a real rising challenge of crime in general, but specifically in the Arab sector, and a tremendous number of incidents of really, including murders within villages in the center of Israel and the south and in the north, crime and internal challenges in all of these communities. And Netanyahu is actually, including Amir Ohana, who is the Minister of Interior, have actually placed a great deal of effort in beginning to resolve those challenges, Mansour Abbas has actually been collaborating behind the scenes for quite a while on all of those issues to advance, the real needs of the people he represents, the population he represents. And that was one of the most important elements of our work together in the committee, including holding a joint discussion in the overlap between addictions or, the use or substance abuse and crime. And the work that we were able to do together in understanding that what binds us together is far greater than what sets us apart. And there was no better way to actually drive that home than our Sunday tours between ultra-Orthodox and secular, Jews and Arabs of all ages, men and women. It did not matter. That was something that was made very clear. And we may touch upon this later on, but we have to remember that the Abraham Accords are also a pivotal moment in the relationship internally between Jews and Arabs in the state of Israel. And I don't know if everybody knows this, but despite COVID-19 and all of its challenges, tens of thousands of Israelis, half of them Arabs, about 50,000 of Israelis visited the UAE, after the signing of the Abraham Accords, half of them Israeli Arabs. And so I think that a renewed renegotiation of the relationship between Jews and Arabs in the state of Israel. And that is what we're seeing, especially now. One more piece that we may touch upon later is, of course, the understanding that some of those parties are very extreme. Lahav referred to, in terms of communist ideology, whereas some, in the case of Mansour Abbas, it's Islamist, that has a lot in common with the ultra-Orthodox parties and share a lot of convictions, including around LGBTQ+ and the challenges we've seen in this Knesset, and even in this specific election campaign. So you see the tensions internally in each of the parties, and certainly between the various factions of the Joint Arab List, and why it might fracture over these issues.
Just before we continue, everyone, do feel free to post questions in the chat. We'll get onto your questions later. Raoul, I was just going to ask you, talk us through the coalition dynamics now, because we're in a situation where Mansour Abbas might be able to decide to prop up a right-wing government or to bring Netanyahu down. What does he demand, and how did he suddenly become kosher when Netanyahu spent 3 election campaigns saying that the Arab parties were beyond the pale?
Well, I think the example that Michal, Knesset member Cotler-Wunsh mentioned, it teaches us something or shows us something about the discussion that we're having, which is whether or not a political party that represents hundreds of thousands of Israelis at the ballot box has a place in Israeli politics. Of course they do, and of course there is going to be a vast range of opinions within the Arab society, some that match some with different sectors of Israeli society. What we've seen over the last, certainly the last decade, and something that perhaps Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is about to become a victim of his own success in, is a delegitimization of the Arab parties in any involvement, really, in the wider Israeli politics. And that has been a specific tactic on the right to, on the one hand, unite the Likud party and the ultra-Orthodox factions, and on the other hand, to create a situation where the left-wing parties have no ability to join with this delegitimate faction of Arabs. And perhaps we're seeing a change now. It's going to be very difficult to imagine personally, it's very difficult to imagine a coalition coming out from the numbers we have. But the discussion that we're having, I think, says something to the place of Israeli Arabs in Israeli politics and the place that they've been pushed to, and that maybe we might see some sort of change in the next few weeks.
I'd like to interject.
Okay,
I do think Netanyahu very obviously played a role here, and there's no denying that. But as you can see from the split between Abbas and the Joint List, the Joint List traditionally, and the parties making up the Joint List, didn't want to be part of coalitions for a number of reasons, but including because they didn't want to be quote unquote complicit in what the government does vis-a-vis the Palestinians. And now, even though it's a relatively peaceful time, the Joint List doesn't want to cooperate with Netanyahu. They don't want to be seen cooperating with Netanyahu. So it's a two-way street. Netanyahu holds more power, but I think that they have pushed themselves in the corner to some extent as well. And we haven't even gotten into the antics of Balad, which I will just mention. I don't think that Balad won one group out of the 4 and now 3 that makes the Joint List.
Although I think they're going to get only 1 seat, given that the Joint List collapsed to 6 seats.
Right. So that's what I'm saying. I don't think that Balad's actions need to disqualify everyone else, but just to give an example, a fairly recent Balad Knesset member went to prison because while he was a Knesset member, he smuggled cell phones and documents to Palestinian terrorists in prison. So you can't just say that it's Netanyahu who delegitimized them. Actions like that delegitimize them in the eyes of most Israeli Jews.
So now I'm going to interject one last interjection. I'm just going to jump in just to say the Abraham Accords that I mentioned before. We have to remember the Joint Arab List actually voted against the Abraham Accords. It's very important that we pay attention to that for a moment here. And what we haven't touched upon is, which of those individuals / parties / representatives, and are they in fact the representatives of this Arab public that would like to integrate, accepts or does not accept the right of the state of Israel to exist as what it is, i.e. Jewish and democratic, not democratic state of all of its citizens, right? Which some of the parties would say,
Michal,
of course we support.
Big ideological questions, but I'm just noticing since we're short on time, I want to try to zoom back to the question of what happened last night. So before we open up to questions from the audience, I'm not going to ask anyone to make predictions. None of us are prophets. But if we can try to understand what are the options now for what might happen, given who maybe has an election to go to 5th elections, bearing in mind we have presidential elections coming up in the summer, something people aren't really talking about. The president will be elected by the Knesset. There has been talk maybe Netanyahu might want the presidency. That gives him 7 years of immunity and at least a ceremonial position of power. I've floated the idea, at least maybe he'll want Benny Gantz to become president in order to disqualify him from the rotation that would otherwise automatically the hallways of the Knesset. So, reporting and speaking to all the politicians behind the scenes. So, what happens now? Talk us through the next stages and possible scenarios. A prediction I'll ask you to make at the end, but let's now possible scenarios. Lahav?
So,
Raoul, go for it. I think maybe Lahav might not be hearing us.
No, I hear you.
But
Raoul, go ahead.
Okay.
So, I mean, I think you did a very good job in putting out the main options that sit before us. But as you said, there's the obvious options are to form a coalition, which sounds like a ridiculous thing to say, but that's what has been
easier said than done.
Failed to be done for the past 2 years now. When I say form a coalition, I mean a candidate, in this case Netanyahu, form a coalition of over 61 seats in the 120 Knesset, and bring in Yamina and potentially people from the other side. And bring in a number of parties. And what we would ideally see in a normal situation would be one candidate bring in parties that would support them, and then we would form a coalition. In this case, because we have these two blocks, the pro-Netanyahu bloc and the anti-Netanyahu bloc, or as you described them, the change Netanyahu bloc, it's very difficult to see how any of the parties would move over. What's being discussed at the moment is the potential of bringing in defectors, or bringing or splitting up parties and joining them together with some of the other options, and that's certainly one option open to Netanyahu. On the other side of the political spectrum, there are a few options that that could come up that we are that would not necessarily involve someone we expect being prime minister, taking a short period of time in some sort of transitional government to perhaps pass a budget, being prime minister in. There are various options that that are open to some of the leaders on the left, but at the moment it does seem like none of those options are more likely than the continued deadlock.
Maybe
Michal,
I just wanted to maybe
in the Knesset, do you see any scenarios? Yes, do you see any scenarios that maybe the pundits are missing, and you think actually behind the scenes, you think there's a connection that might be made to avoid the specter of fifth elections?
So I'll say the following. First of all, I say this with a great deal of humility and caution, because we have to remember that there are about 450,000 double envelopes that have not even, they're only going to be starting to count them tonight. That could actually make an impact on everything we've seen. So the shift that we saw, from yesterday to today, that could happen, and in any which way. There's even, as Kameo the theme, so the agreement between Yamina and Tikva Chadasha can actually, yes, can move a mandate from one side to the other side, because the sides that we've spoken about are, of course, only, for Netanyahu or against Netanyahu. The good news is about the Israeli public is, there's this great muscular, moderate majority. Somewhere right there in the middle. I'd say 80% of us agree on 80% of the issues, 80% of the time. And somehow, in this frenetic 4 elections under 2 years, there is not an ability to form a coalition because of the splitting issue down the middle at the moment, literally down the middle. It's the only issue on which we split down the middle. Actually, if we talked about all the other issues that we may, if we'll get to tonight, we could probably come up with a majority government. And that is, I say that as good news. I mean, call me, hopeful or whatever, but I say that as good news because when you look at the situation around the world, I also say it as good news because we're a young country. But when you look at the rest of the world and you look at very polarized societies, I mean, this is really challenging. Don't get me wrong. Certainly, the last year has been really, really crazy. And the fact that we cannot pass a budget at the time of COVID-19 with all of its challenges is really challenging on so many levels. But there could be, and this is where I'm going to take a leap of faith here, there could be options that we do not see, because the anti-Bibi sort of coalition has existed and is very strong and deep over the last several years. There are all kinds of discussions that have gone on behind the scenes, below the radar, that now is going to be the time to capitalize on them and see if really everybody, all the players are willing to put aside both the ideology that may divide them. So when you think of, some of the partners to this coalition, they're really unlikely partners, but it may be that if, forgive the pun, but if, not Bibi trumps everything, then they will come to some sort of an arrangement. And that could range from a really, really sort of strange bedfellows that we can't imagine right now to the very obvious. So something that we can imagine that's much more manageable, that will depend on the final count, that will move 2 mandates over this side and 1 over to the other, and we'll work things out. The fact that Ram now becomes a potential kingmaker, to me, is a missed opportunity in many ways, because that's what we could have been discussing over a proper election campaign, with vision for integration of, all of Israel's citizens and so forth. But we may be having those conversations, seems that we are, after the election, as part of the process that we are in. To create this coalition. I would imagine that there are some really crazy thoughts being explored out there.
Yeah, I mean,
Lahav, what sort of crazy thoughts do you think might be exploding to get us out of what looks like an inevitable decline to a 5th election?
I mean, I think it's a long shot. I think that the most likely scenario is a 5th election. The second most likely scenario is probably Netanyahu forming a right-wing coalition by convincing some of the people of Likud who left and joined New Hope to come back. And that does seem likely, because I don't think a lot of those people left Likud in order to be in the opposition. As far as the sort of crazy scenarios, like, it's possible to have a sort of unity government led by Naftali Bennett, with Gideon Sa'ar and Yair Lapid and maybe even the Haredi parties. But it seems extremely far-fetched, especially to get Yair Lapid and the Haredi parties together. I have trouble imagining Bennett actually being in a coalition either with the joint list or that is dependent on the joint list for its survival, even if they're not officially members of the coalition. I think that would basically destroy Bennett, because for all the lovely things that we said about Arab society and that they're sort of politically integrating more, that's just not what I think Naftali Bennett's voters are looking for. And so I think it is a really long shot, but stranger things have happened. I also think that the people who oppose Bibi or are on the fence about Bibi could really, really obstruct him in the interim while the negotiations are going on to build a coalition. There were attempts to do that after the second and third elections. A new Knesset speaker was voted in that wasn't from Likud, they could do that again. They could bring up bills that say you can't be prime minister if you're under indictment, for example, and all kinds of other things like that. And I really wouldn't be surprised if those things come on the agenda, because, in Israel, the parliament is sworn in and then the government could be sworn in weeks later. And I think that we'll have action during that kind of limbo period.
Interesting. We have some questions from the audience now, and I'm just conscious of the time. So maybe if we have one person just volunteer to jump in and answer that question, so we can try to get through as many questions as possible. One question from Lenny from New York takes us back to why we're in this political balagan to begin with, and that is, why does Lieberman hate Netanyahu so much? Why did he split off from Netanyahu's bloc back in April 2019, and why 3 elections after that has he not returned to his natural place in the right-wing bloc? Because as the numbers show, the right wing has a majority in Israel. So what is the history of that personal animus? Why has Lieberman decided to try to take Netanyahu down? Who wants to take that?
I could take that. I mean, Lieberman is Netanyahu back to the 1990s. Lieberman was a senior aide to Netanyahu in Netanyahu's first term as prime minister. There's a really great picture of them when they're young, and like Lieberman has like a gun slung over his shoulder, and they're in some settlements, I don't remember where. So they go way back. But Lieberman quit as Netanyahu's chief of staff to establish his own party, Israel Beiteinu, that was meant to represent Russian-speaking immigrants, but also very right-wing. Fast forward to 2018 when Lieberman leaves the coalition. The thing is, Lieberman is quite right-wing, although he's always been for a two-state solution, just a sort of different idea of it than most. But he's still always been quite right-wing. He often used very strong anti-Arab rhetoric in his campaigns. And so, these days people are calling him sort of the moderate right or whatever, because he won't sit with Netanyahu, but it used to be when people draw the spectrum, they would put him pretty close to where the Kahanists are now. In any case, the other element, though, of Lieberman's sort of ideology that's been fairly consistent over time is that he's secularist. He wants greater separation between religion and state in Israel, and more options for Russian-speaking immigrants who might not be halakhically Jewish to conduct life cycle events in Israel without all the difficulties that they have now. And over time, that's hardened into a strong anti-Haredi stance. So in 2018, there was a Supreme Court order from the government to sort of get its act together and pass some sort of law that would actually have Haredim either enlist in the IDF or do national civilian service. And like every other court order before, the government was ready to basically ignore it or ask for postponement. And Lieberman said he had it, and he put his foot down, and he said, you know, if this is not going to happen, I'm going to leave the coalition, and he left. So that explains why he led to the 2019 election happening in the beginning of the year instead of in November. It doesn't necessarily explain why he won't join any Netanyahu-led coalition. If you ask Lieberman, he doesn't talk about it being personal or anything. He basically focuses on the Haredim. Netanyahu is dependent on the Haredim to build coalitions. He mostly gives them whatever they want. And Lieberman wants the opposite of what the Haredim want, so he thinks he's never going to get anything out of Netanyahu. If we're being honest, I also think that Lieberman enjoys being a little bit of a troll. I don't think that that's, you know, per se his reason for throwing the country into disarray. I also think that the disarray is definitely not just Lieberman's fault, but I think he sort of enjoys the role of, you know, being the troll, basically the one who sort of drives everyone a little bit crazy and does things that are unexpected.
Thank you, Lahav. We have another question. Actually, several people have posed the same question, which I hear a lot, which is maybe the problem is the system. Maybe the problem is the electoral system. It's too proportionate. Maybe we need to have first past the post. Why can't we just have two parties like in America? Maybe we need to restrict, impose term limits for the prime minister. And you know what? Maybe after 4 consecutive elections with a 5th in the offing, maybe it's time to think that maybe we need to rewrite the rules of the game because the system is broken, and that might be what gets us out of this, as we say in Hebrew, plonta, Gordian knot. Who wants to take that?
So, Eylon, I would love to take that actually, and also to piggyback on what Lahav said before, if that's okay.
Please.
And it's not just specifically to electoral reform. I think when it comes to reform in general, what we see, and certainly that's been my experience in the last year's Knesset, what we see is that we are in a bit of a stagnation. And, you know, we've had the same prime minister for over 10 years, and the fact that there has been no reform in many structural challenges that the state of Israel faces, not just the electoral reform that's necessary, I would argue, for term limitations and you know, for a different kind of representational democracy and so on. But when you look at the way that, you know, when the state of Israel was founded and this multi-party system that needed to represent a very diverse sort of coming together from all over diaspora to one country, you know, and indigenous people, yes, returning to its homeland, but from all over the world. And the need for that kind of representation might have been more evident at the time. I would argue that actually a maturing country, a growing country, an aging country, we're turning 73 this year, it's still young, so I give us that sort of benefit, and we're still the founding generation. I believe that reform is actually the responsibility of our generation. So I often say that if our founding mothers and fathers lay down the physical infrastructure of the country that we are so fortunate to live in, it is the role of our generation to lay down the next tier, the, you know, exactly spiritual type of infrastructure, if we might speak of, also that comes into play with regards to electoral reform. But beyond that, if I talk about good governance and some of, you know, a little bit of what Lav said about Lieberman, but we have to remind ourselves that all of the parties that, you know, were on that great BICOM map, not all, but many on the, you know, right of center are actually former Likud members. Naftali Bennett, Avigdor Lieberman, Gideon Sa'ar, Kachlon, who's no longer in the system, are all former members of Likud that came probably, as I did, with this great, you know, sort of sense of need to reform, but we're incapable of actually pushing forward reforms. And from that place of incapability, or maybe disablement of reform, and maybe even a way of working that the current prime minister has with other people that is not a very collaborative way of working. We certainly felt it as people who entered the unity government with blue and white, and that is not the working habit. But I would also argue that it's a paradigm shift that it's not to do only specifically with this prime minister. It's a paradigm shift that's necessary in Israel in terms of good governance and transparency and accountability and representational democracy that is very different than what I'm accustomed to coming from Canada, and maybe the way that I served in Knesset, but not the way at all other MKs are required to serve. All of those structural changes and reforms, yes, they are necessary. Yes, they are needed, and I believe it's part of the reason that, again, this being part of the process, part of the reason that Lieberman may have left, sort of, and, slammed the door behind him, and others have as well. And part of the reluctance to enter a unity government with that same prime minister who doesn't seem to be able to or want to collaborate in any way, shape, or form for those necessary reforms.
If I could just add one.
Raoul, you wanted to jump in there?
One short addition. In 1990, after the so-called stinking trick of Shimon Peres to try and bring down the government, there was efforts, there was calls to change the system. The smaller parties could have blackmail. There was suggestion the smaller parties had blackmail power over the larger parties, and there was a call to introduce the direct election for the prime minister. In fact, the Likud party was meant to vote against that vote, and there was one member of the Likud party that rebelled, and the vote passed 57 to 56. That member of Likud was called Benjamin Netanyahu. The law was actually pushed off. And
let's let people guess who it was. There you go. Okay, give it away.
The first person to benefit from that law was Benjamin Netanyahu. But what happened was a disastrous experiment in Israeli politics, where we tried a system that had never been tried before to solve a problem that the country was bang in the middle of. Right now, we're bang in the middle of a political deadlock that's lasted 2 years, that's never been experienced like this before in the state of Israel. This is not the time to be changing the rules of the game as the game is taking place. The solution to this problem, I think, cannot come through reform that will ultimately skew towards one side or the other. The solution to this problem has to come from the rules of the game that have been set at the moment.
I think, first of all, I actually
Raoul, it's
wrote
interesting
an article.
you say that we shouldn't change the rules of the game, just 1 second off. It's interesting, Raoul, that you say we shouldn't change the rules of the game in the middle, because, when it seemed that Benny Gantz might fall underneath the electoral threshold, there was a big question everyone was asking, wait a minute, if he's the alternate prime minister and he's meant to take over in November, what happens if he's not an MK anymore? And suddenly Israelis discovered the dangers of changing the rules on the go. And perhaps that's a salient lesson for not changing the rules in the middle of the game. But Lahav?
Yeah, first of all, I actually wrote an article on this very subject today, so I encourage people to go on jpost.com and look at it. But I spoke to different experts, researchers, and about their views on this, and a lot of those views were sort of expressed here by Michal and Raoul, sort of yes, it's the right thing to do, no, it's not the right thing to do, or at least not right now. But I think the bottom line is that there's no actual political possibility of it happening right now while we're in the middle of all this. And so even if electoral reform could theoretically untangle this Gordian knot, it's not going to happen unless there is a broad and stable political coalition, which there's not going to be one until we're already out of this situation. I just want to sort of circle back to what I'd mentioned before, though, which is that I do think there is a chance that the anti-Netanyahu bloc, or the change bloc, which is a new name Yair Lapid made up yesterday, but a lot of people seem to have adopted it. The change bloc, I think there's a good chance that they will try to make minor changes to the rules of the game that could have a major impact, such as passing laws that would disqualify Netanyahu from running from becoming prime minister again, after the fifth election because of his indictments.
And maybe just to piggyback off that, I just a word of caution, and that's what we experienced with the coalition agreement with Blue and White, is that hard cases make bad law, and bad law makes very hard cases. And I say it as a cautionary tale. Also, as Raoul said, and as Lahav said, in the situation that we're in, we can't imagine making any kind of reform. And on the other hand, Raoul, part of the reason that we may never be able to make that reform is it's become actually, sort of the way that the system will never be reformed, right? So we can just keep going to elections, and that is the bind that we are in. And Lahav is right. That Gordian knot, we need to find that, the end of the thread to begin to unravel it from. And that is the challenge of the moment. that may bind more parties together that we cannot imagine will decide that this is what, the one way that we're in.
Stranger things have happened. Lahav, we have time for just one more audience question. So Lahav, maybe you want to take this quickly with your diplomatic hat. If indeed Netanyahu gets another government, perhaps with a number of defectors, or somehow manages to muster a majority, where does that leave the whole question of annexation that was on the table over the summer, the extension of Israeli law to Judea and Samaria of the West Bank? Is that now firmly off the table because of the agreements with the United Arab Emirates, or could we see that resurface if we get what Netanyahu promised, which is a full right-wing government?
I think it's off the table, not just because of the agreement with the United Arab Emirates, which Israel, at least at the time, had said that it temporarily took sovereignty issues off the table. But I think it's off the table.
And we know in Israel that
because
temporary is the most permanent thing there is.
Yes, and also Joe Biden is president and not Donald Trump. And I think that's the reason it won't happen. I think he'll face a lot of pressure if he has his, what does he call it? Yamin al-Maleh, totally right-wing government, as Netanyahu called it. If he has that government, there'll be a lot of pressure. There'll be a lot of private initiatives coming up in the Knesset to try to change laws in certain ways to move towards extending sovereignty. But Netanyahu won't let it happen. I mean, even when Trump was president, Netanyahu was moving very slowly and cautiously to the point that I doubted he even really was going to make it happen.
Okay. On that note, I did promise that I wouldn't ask you to make predictions at the beginning, but now I do want you to make predictions. In a word, I want your prediction and then a sentence to try to explain it. Are we looking at fifth elections, a sixth Netanyahu government, Prime Minister Yair Lapid, or some sort of surprise that's going to blindside us all? Raoul?
I think we're going to see a surprise. I'll throw out a crazy idea of Prime Minister Benny Begin. And I can expand if you'd like, but I think
a sentence to elaborate.
Yeah, I'd love to hear that.
I think that there could be there could be an appetite for a temporary government to pass a budget that would last.
Yes, that's a curveball.
I think that there would be he's a candidate that a lot of people could get behind, and I think that in some sort of agreement of a temporary government. To pass a budget, that it's a possibility. Maybe him, maybe another name.
But he would be
Prime Minister Begin the second would certainly be an interesting
as
twist.
Lieberman called him.
I tend to agree with Raoul that.
Lahav, do you want to give us your prediction?
I just made that. I called him Prime Minister Feinschmecker because Lieberman once called Benny Begin the Feinschmecker from Likud. But I don't like to make predictions. I do, with a heavy heart, think that the most likely scenario is another election. But stranger things have happened.
I would maybe just say that I believe that finally the majority of the party leaders are fully aware that going to another election is unacceptable as far as the public is concerned. I actually see, the drop in voting as an indication. Sorry, can you hear me? Hello?
I hear you.
Oh, maybe I got cut off. Eylon, can you hear me?
So, yes, I can. Now you're on mute.
Oh, okay.
I nearly got to the end of that audio.
I was just saying that I believe that the party leaders, much like Raoul's prediction, and I don't know what this surprise scenario will look like, but I think it is more likely that we will see some sort of a surprise scenario not, I can't assure us of that, but more likely that we will see that surprise scenario, because I believe that most of the party leaders realize the great discontent of the public. And as I was saying, the indication to that, of course, is the lowering sort of voting statistics of yesterday, and the growing discontent among the entire public of all sectors, and the likelihood of actually each of the parties being able to pass or to surpass the successful results of yesterday's elections for many of those party leaders. So I would join Raoul's prediction that we're going to see some sort of an unexpected possible coalition.
Bottom line prediction.
Yeah, no, that's it. We will see that. I mean, I don't know who's going to stand at the helm. Benny Begin was not one I thought of. I even imagined that Gans could stand.
Okay.
That actually could that Gans could actually sort of be called on to stand at the head of such a sort of surprise coalition, because he would be agreed upon by more of the parties than possibly any of the other candidates. Sorry,
that's very interesting, the possibility of putting in a non-threatening person at the helm. There's briefly considered doing so with Moshe Ya'alon, but perhaps that's what could end the current plunter. On that note, just before summing up, I want to thank our guests, and probably all get some sleep. A member of Knesset, Michal Cotler-Wunsh, outgoing member from the Blue White Party. Thank you very much for joining us. Lahav Harkov from the Jerusalem Post as well. Thank you very much. And as you said, everyone go to the Jerusalem Post to read Lahav's report there. And Raoul Wootliff from the Times of Israel. Thank you very much for joining us as well. That brings us to the end of this panel discussion. As we've seen from our panelists, no one really knows what's going to happen next, and 2 out of 3 at least predicted that we're going to have a curveball, a surprise that's going to shock everyone, because as it stands, we said Netanyahu doesn't seem to have a majority to form a government. He would need to get both the religious nationalists and the Islamists on board together. At the same time, it doesn't seem like Yair Lapid has the numbers either, certainly not to be able to form a government, although maybe to block Netanyahu. And so one possibility is that we end up going towards 5th elections. No one wants it to happen, but it's simply the default option if the parties aren't able to form a government. Really extraordinary political circumstances in Israel. Let's remember, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been Prime Minister for 15 years on and off since 1996. Really a larger-than-life figure, but he's also a criminal defendant at the moment. He is actively standing trial on 3 cases of corruption. At the same time, ran a campaign, one with Israel's incredible vaccine miracle, 2 the peace agreements with the United Arab Emirates and other Arab countries, hoping that that will raise his stature and reputation among the Israeli public and make them forget perhaps some of the other things that the opposition has been complaining about. If one thing is sure in Israeli elections, is that it's never boring, and there are so many moving pieces that make it fascinating to observe, slightly more stressful to experience and live here on the ground. Thank you, everyone from the audience. I'm sorry we couldn't go through more questions because of the time restraints. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. And on that note, I'd like to hand over back to Mandy from the UJIA, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Eylon. I want to thank you. It's really a rare privilege not only to be an event for an hour, which is enjoyable and you don't actually have to get in your car to go to, but actually our WhatsApp group for our events team was like, we didn't know that. How can we not? And we're a pretty educated bunch of people. So thank you. It was absolutely fascinating. I want to thank you in particular. I'd also like to thank our partners at BICOM for that brilliant graphic at the beginning. And I want to thank everybody that joined us this evening. Keep watching the news. We do not know where this is going and where we all end up, but we will carry on and find out. And thank you all for joining us this evening, and we'll see you again soon. Laila Tov.